on Mystery, tonight at 9 on KCTS 9 Seattle.
In keeping with Chevron's tradition of service throughout the 20th century, the people of Chevron bring you this program in support of public television.
George, I want to congratulate you on the success of this marvelous institution out here that you call the World's Fair. Call it a century of progress. Well, you can call it a century of progress. I'll call it a World's Fair. That's all there is to that.
The eyes of the United States are fixed on the future. Yes, our wagon is still hitched to a star.
Ladies and gentlemen, we take great pleasure in christening this car and the Sky Ride, the official Amos and the Sky Ride of the Chicago World's Fair. Here we go.
Get it.
I didn't mess with that thing, did I?
By dialing 1964, I launch the final phase of this great effort.
It is my high honor and privilege to declare Expo 74 officially open to all the citizens of the world.
Give a fair, and the President of the United States will be there, no matter who he is, no matter what his politics, no matter what affairs of state are clamoring for attention. I'm Bill Moyers, and I know Lyndon Johnson felt that way. He was willing to brave rain, political rivals, and the threat of civil rights demonstrations to open the 1964 World's Fair in New York. Why? Because a fair is a cause for celebration, and politicians love to celebrate. President William McKinley wrote, "Expositions are the timekeepers of progress, the records of the world's advancement. They stimulate the energy, enterprise, and intellect of the people. They quicken human genius." That was before he got assassinated while attending the 1901 World's Fair at Buffalo. Still, it was a pretty apt assessment. Fairs are ready-made for a little self-congratulatory backslapping and a swell occasion for optimism. I'm talking here about World's Fairs, not industrial or agricultural expositions, colorful though they may be. American World's Fairs evolved from the great trade shows of Europe, and once on this side of the Atlantic, they quickly became launching pads for new products and showcases for feats of technological daring-do, of which there were always a great many. Everyone could get a gander at the experiments that might soon become the mainsprings of our daily lives. Small wonder historians see fairs as a grand expression of our innovation and as a gauge of our faith in ourselves and our faith in the future. Certainly we took such measure at the World's Fairs of the 20th century.
The classic recipe for a World's Fair calls for a few time-honored ingredients: fireworks,
plenty of music, a Ferris wheel, much ballyhoo, and the promise of an adventurous break from the daily routine. Knoxville, Tennessee dished up its version in the summer of '82, adding a dash of Southern culture to give this fair its special flavor. By night, carnival diversions spread as far as the eye could see. By day, the grounds took on a more serious look, that of an international assemblage whose common purpose was to inspire all comers with the theme, Energy Turns the World. Like all World's fairs, this one promised a combination of entertainment and learning. This time, the promise was enough to lure 11 million visitors at $10 a ticket. For their money, they got a state-of-the-art fair, plus a day-long respite from the frets and worries of the outside world. At center stage, the $22.5 million U.S. Pavilion, where planners set out to acquaint us with the means by which we'll propel ourselves into the future.
Welcome, humanoids, to Energy Unlimited. My name is Quadracom, and I have traveled through time and space to tell you humans of the types of energy you'll be using in this country for the next 50 years.
Have you ever worked in a nuclear power plant before? No? All right, great. You're going to work in one today. Why don't you turn around and take
Robots, computers, and nuclear energy figured heavily in the mix. But no one needed to be as sophisticated as the technology to take in this pavilion's cheerful pitch.
Now, we're going to try to split this uranium atom with neutrons from that gun in a process called fission. So, Robin, you take aim and shoot the uranium atom. Go for it. Okay, you got it. The uranium atom absorbs the neutron. You can stop now. It gets excited. It starts to vibrate, pulsate. Pretty soon it splits apart and releases a tremendous amount of energy. Now, when those uranium atoms...
For those who found the future intimidating or incomprehensible, there was also the remembrance of fairs past, and homage to the wonders first displayed at the great-grandpappy of 20th century American fairs, the world's Columbian Exposition. It was a grand celebration of American ascendancy.
The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 set up this beautiful city. It's called the Dream City, all white. And people came from all across the world to see that fair, to participate in that fair. One woman walked from Galveston, Texas to Chicago, Illinois, 1,500 miles on the railroad tracks to get to that fair.
Tom Judd of the State University of New York teaches the history of technology through innovations that first appeared at fairs.
People came from all over the world selling their kitchen stoves, giving away their burial money to get to that fair.
Why?
Because that fair seemed to capture the spirit of America, perhaps the spirit of Western civilization, that you could build something magnificent.
The Chicago Fair is now remembered for its architecture, for Thomas Edison's moving pictures, and for the Ferris wheel, named for its inventor, George Washington Gale Ferris. By the time the Pan American Exposition opened in Buffalo in 1901, fairgoers knew they could count on a multitude of midway thrills. Among Buffalo's biggest hits, the food booths with free samples. People also came to gawk at babies at a child hatchery and at Sioux chiefs at an Indian convention. The intent of this fair was to foster trade expansion, but by far its most important legacy was the Tower of Light. Until it lit up this entire fair, electricity was regarded only as an expensive and somewhat dangerous toy. Next came St. Louis, and the grandest fair to date. With an airfield, an enormous sports stadium, and 3 hours of fireworks on dedication day, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904 promised the best, the biggest, and the newest of everything under the sun.
Meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair. Don't tell me the lights are shining any place but there. We will dance the hoochie coochie. I will be your tootsie wootsie. Meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair.
Besides that still familiar tune, St. Louis gave us the safety razor, rayon, iced tea, and when the summer sun caused a shortage of reusable cups, the delicious, edible ice cream cone. Also on display were whole villages of natives from exotic lands. And underlying every spectacle was a newfound attitude toward technology and tomorrow.
The 1904 fair is remembered mostly for transportation. And I suppose this is because an automobile actually drove from Washington to St. Louis and didn't break down once in the entire trip. Now, people had been flying around in balloons for 100 years, back at least to the early 19th century in France. It's one thing to fly around in a balloon and not know where you're going to land, and another thing to go up in a balloon and go from one place to another place and to return.
To really have control.
To really have control of this. A large money prize was being offered for anyone who could get their dirigible up in the air, go 100 miles in one direction, and then turn around and come back.
Did anybody win?
No, but they came close. They came very close. No one actually made it, but it showed that it was just around the corner. What no one recognized, of course, was that the airplane was just around the corner.
No one won the dirigible contest, but Americans won 23 first-place track and field medals at the Olympic Games held that summer as part of the fair. The records they posted raised some interesting questions.
People began to ask, are they really making world's records? Could not a native who has thrown a javelin all his life, or an Indian who has shot a bow and arrow all his life, be more accurate and more proficient than these white males from Western civilization? So they tested this. At the conclusion of the Olympic Games, they had something called anthropology games.
Anthropology games?
Anthropology games, where they brought all the natives from the various pavilions that were at the St. Louis Fair, and they had archery contests and javelin throwing contests and jumping contests, all of the events that were part of the Olympics. And by and large, the natives did not do very well in these contests.
And what was the result of this?
The result of this was the recognition that these records that were being set in the Olympic Games were indeed the world records. And it's part of this development in 20th century civilization, the recognition that efficiency can be taught through scientific techniques. At the same time that coaches are coaching through scientific technique for better performance, we have the development of scientific management.
And the World's Fair gave legitimacy to that claim.
Right, in a very different area, but it gave that legitimacy to scientific management.
Hello, Frisco, hello. Hello, Frisco, hello.
Scientific and technological advances were hurtling into our lives at an unheard-of pace in the years just before we entered World War I, and the Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915 meant to celebrate all of them. Pride in our latest accomplishments ran as high and as loopy as Art Smith in his exhibition biplane.
Don't keep me waiting, it's aggravating.
After all, San Francisco had rebuilt itself after the quake. Teddy Roosevelt had built the Panama Canal. Long-distance phoning was possible, and Americans had discovered cafeteria dining.
Your voice is like music. to my ear.
Taking bows, strutting our stuff, seemed just the ticket. Why are people interested in such things?
Well, in the past, they were interested in World's Fairs because World's Fairs gave us a photograph of the present, a story of our past progress, and a vision of the future that really was an inspiring vision. Secondly, I think it was because people didn't have television in those days. And they would hear about these developments, perhaps see a picture of these developments in their magazines, and wish to go and see the actual invention itself.
Not without reason. Various World's Fairs had already been showcases for the Corliss engine, everybody's windmills, Otis's elevator, McCormick's reaper, the glider, the telegraph, Edison's phonograph, Bell's telephone, the first electric stove, the automatic milking machine. And at some fairs, you could order a car in the morning, watch it be assembled during the day, and drive away in it that night. The scientist C.P. Snow wrote that until this century, social change was so slow it would pass unnoticed in one person's lifetime. This is no longer so, he said. The rate of change has increased so much that our imagination can't keep up. We of the late 20th century tend to think of ourselves as having some sort of franchise on Future Shock. Not so. Future Shock arrived early this century with the inventions we've just seen. The difference is that at least in the beginning of this century, we seem to have reason to believe that all changes were improvements. Such belief was held with an almost religious fervor. World's Fairs were a kind of mighty revival. Believers came to have their faith renewed. Skeptics faced the possibility of conversion. Then came the savagery of World War I and the pandemonium of the 20s, the shock of the crash, all casting shadows of doubt over the crystal ball that once showed such a sunny future. Fairs changed too, and I asked Tom Judd about how those changes showed themselves in the Chicago World's Fair of 1933.
The official theme of the World's Fair
Of 33?
of 1933, the official theme in the official guidebook was science finds, industry applies, man conforms. Human beings losing control of their technology is the message that I get out of the 1933 World's Fair. General Electric had as its exhibit the House of Magic. It's not a house of understanding. It's a house of magic, that science is beyond the everyday working man or woman who comes to the fair. The message here is, look, we'll entertain you, we'll dazzle you with our magic of science. The Hall of Science had a huge statue of a robot leading two trembling human beings, a man and a woman, into the future. Man and woman are not in control of science. Science is in control of man and woman.
Chicago called its fair a century of progress and meant it to be a futuristic celebration of the city's 100th anniversary. But in 1933, the Depression had made us nostalgic for less troubled times. Yankee virtues were back in style. Early on, there'd been talk of canceling the fair, but Chicago went ahead simply to provide badly needed jobs. That this fair made money had less to do with visions of a flawless future than with the fact that the planners understood people's need for cheerful and reassuring distractions. Foremost among them, a concourse of foreign villages, a refined version of the phenomenon from earlier fairs. Gone were the dog-eating Igorots of St. Louis and the rain-dancing Iroquois of Buffalo. Here, instead, in a single day, fairgoers could tour an entire world of happy, dancing natives. At the end of the concourse, a feature that had been the secret of financial success at many a fair. First, there was Little Egypt. She danced up a storm in 1893 at Chicago, where she was billed as having educated muscles. Fatima took the turn of the century by shock, wiggling herself in a way that hadn't been wiggled in Buffalo before. By 1933, Hoochie Coochie came in the form of Sally Rand, some form. Each time the police raided her fan and bubble dance, attendance at the fair shot up. Insult to the Ladies' Purity League and injury to public morals were not the work of Rand alone. Mike Todd offered a bevy of dancing beauties, and Texas Guinan, of Prohibition fame, resisted all efforts to add wisps of chiffon to her troops' bare bones. The finance men, of course, gazed fondly only on their balanced books. For those with an aversion to the fleshpots of fairs, there always have been plenty of other thrills. So much a part of World's Fairs are gut-wrenching rides that there is now a move afoot to refurbish the most thrilling among them. Helen Harrison, art critic and museum curator, is trying to rescue the parachute jump left from the 1939 fair.
Oh, people lined up to go on this, and they lined up to watch other people go on it. They really enjoyed the people screaming as they came down. Those guy wires that hang down would help to keep the chutes from tangling, but unfortunately, if there was a wind, the guy wires themselves would tangle up, and several people were stuck on it from varying lengths of time. There was even a couple married on it during the 1940 season.
Somehow, going to the fair imprints itself on a person's memory in a very powerful way, doesn't it?
Well, it's a group experience in a way that watching television or going to the movies is not. It does go back to the old-fashioned idea of getting together in a country fair or some kind of an enjoyment group activity, an amusement park.
The '39 New York Fair called itself the World of Tomorrow. Outside its gates, the world seemed on the verge of chaos, which may explain why within the fair, everything seemed to emphasize control, precision, like Billy Rose's Aqua Cave.
These places still attract people because you have a chance to see and experience things in the company of others. It's not a private activity. You could go with your boyfriend, girlfriend. It's something that you share together rather than something you experience on your own.
Any significance to this?
Well, the trilon and perisphere was the theme symbol.
Say that again.
Yes, these are invented Greek, pseudo-Greek terms that describe these two forms. The perisphere, or the circular form, was intended to represent the earthly realm, and the trilon, of which this is a three-sided triangular column, which is rather a dumpy version, was meant to symbolize the hope for the future, the forward-looking or upward-looking vision that the fair was supposed to represent.
The inside of the trilon was empty, and the entire fair was built on what 6 months before had been an enormous ash heap. But within the perisphere was Democracy, the ultimate expression of this fair's theme. So grim was the news from the outside world that radio broadcasts were banned from the grounds. Visitors trooped up the helicline, knowing they could indulge in uninterrupted fantasy of a flawless, classless, odorless, trouble-free future.
Well, the concept behind the fair was very high-minded. It had a lot to do with the idea that you could plan a better future if everybody who was smart put their heads together, and if people could be convinced that this was the right way to go about it.
Those were years in which sociologists were talking about the people. As distinct from any individual, the people were invested with many mystical notions. The people of the future might wear plastic dresses, and sport Dr. Alexis Carrel's artificial heart. In the world of tomorrow, the people would do their own X-rays and thrill to manufactured sparks. It was this world, too, that anticipated the compact. The Crossley got the endorsement of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, but it seems symbolic that he drove it only around in circles.
Ladies and gentlemen, so that you may enjoy these 10 magic minutes, you have been given a Polaroid viewer. Polaroid material is a product of scientific magic. It makes like-do tricks never thought possible. Take the viewer with the long tab in your right hand. Hold it in front of your eyes.
As the features of the Plymouth are revealed in new dimensions, you will come to realize that indeed, Plymouth is in tune with tomorrow.
Fairs long had mingled elements of the serious and the sublime. By 1939, the two were inextricably mixed. The automobile manufacturers led the way. With social and physical mobility on the rise, the car companies had a great deal to gain by linking their products to any possible vision of the future. So car companies competed with each other in games of lavish showmanship. Where once they'd shared common ground in a single transportation center, they now built whole buildings and filled them with science and industry that seemed to need no help from human hands. Paradoxically, automation at that time was a somewhat scary subject. Jobs were at stake, and the Depression still with us. Exhibit planners ignored the paradox as they put together their optimistic and highly technological vision. Nonetheless, the most popular exhibit at this fair belonged to an auto company.
You don't suppose we could leave the world of tomorrow until the day after. No, I guess not. Well, where's the end of the line?
It's right over there, Gramps. It isn't far.
The General Motors Futurama cost something like $5 million pre-war dollars for the purpose of predicting that far-off year, 1960. 25 million people peered through it into the future. Here was the largest scale model ever built, showing a world of superhighways with 100-mile-an-hour speed limits and orchards where each tree grew under its own canopy of glass.
Strange, fantastic, unbelievable. Remember, this is the world of 1960. Here is the narration plan.
You flew over an arterial highway system which did not exist, a coast-to-coast highway system. It would be like in the 1860s flying over a coast-to-coast railway and suddenly realizing the implications of what it meant to link the continent by rail. Well, here we had it one step further along, linking the continent by road, so that each individual motorist could motor from coast to coast on a continuous ribbon of highway. Of course, these highways were built, although they were built very differently from the way that Norman Bel Geddes, the designer of Futurama, had envisioned them. But the concept of an arterial national highway system, which was begun under the Eisenhower administration, was a very visionary one, and one which really changed the face of the American continent forever.
The city of 1960 has abundant sunshine, fresh air, fine green parkways, recreational and civic centers, all the result of thoughtful planning and design.
Won't it be a wonderful place to live, Gramps?
In the wonder world of 19...
Was their vision of the future as an orderly, immaculate, coherent, planned future right?
Well, it would have been right to think in those terms if the kind of cooperation that they envisioned had come to pass. Of course, the irony of it is that it was happening on the eve of war in a mood which was destroying the very atmosphere in which any such cooperation could have existed.
There's something we haven't mentioned yet, something that made an appearance at the '39 New York Fair. The essayist E.B. White wrote of it. I believe this is going to be a test of the modern world, and that in this new opportunity to see beyond the range of our vision, we shall discover either a new and unbearable disturbance of the general peace or a saving radiance in the sky. We shall stand or fall by this. Of that I am quite sure. This invention of which he was writing had been known in England for some years. There had been some flickering and fleeting demonstrations of it in this country also. But it didn't come to the fair until it was introduced in '39 by David Sarnoff.
It is with a feeling of humbleness that I come to this moment of announcing the birth in this country of a new art so important in its implications that it is bound to affect all society. It is an art which shines like a torch of hope in a troubled world. It is a creative force which we must learn to utilize for the benefit of all mankind.
The invention was, of course, television. Any list of the 20th century's significant inventions has to include it. Even the wonders we now see unfolding, microbiology, space exploration, computer technology, none of these can dwarf the impact of television. Television has changed world's fairs as well. Where once people flocked through the turnstiles for the privilege of seeing the newest of the new, they may now stay home and still be in the know. So why do we still have fairs? Well, for one thing, television has not replaced the thrill of actually being there, at the baseball game, or in the theater, or at the concert, or on the fairgrounds. Many of us still thirst for a first-person experience. And for another thing, we're an adaptable people. If one reason for having a fair no longer obtains, well, we'll find another. It happens all the time. Tom Judd believes the futuristic visions that once were a must for fairs have already been replaced. As if to confirm Tom Judd's theory, Knoxville's International Energy Exposition featured technology as old as the sun itself. Photovoltaic cells didn't power the telephone, just the nightlight inside the booth. This jeepney from the Philippines, a great favorite, used coal for fuel.
One of the most significant developments is the American loss of its belief in progress. Since 1974, polls have been showing that a majority of Americans no longer believe that the future will be better than the present, and the present is better than the past, which is the definition of progress. And that's fundamental.
How is this sense of pessimism reflected in fairs?
If we look at the Knoxville Fair, the most recent fair, there was very little vision offered for the future.
With such doubts in the air, fairgoers seem to prefer a little taste of the past.
This is official World Fair groundhog, because they had contacted him and said, would you like to be eaten at the World's Fair? And he said, what an honor, because when he gets to groundhog heaven, you see, he's going to be the only groundhog up there saying, I got to eat at the World's Fair, and only other groundhogs got to eat on the country table. What is that?
Whatever their preference in food, fun, and exhibits, all comers to this fair served a common purpose. They are helping to underwrite the urban renewal of downtown Knoxville. Every cash register on the grounds was wired to a central computer that instantly calculated Knoxville's part of the take. Every waffle, every soda, every souvenir was a part of the plot. Before the fair, this area was a blighted railway siding, populated mostly by down and outers. The profits from the fair are intended to replace the wrong side of the tracks with a park and convention center, with nary $1 of city taxes at stake. It's the new reason to have a fair. Seattle pioneered the idea in 1962 with its Century 21 exposition, built on the site of an old bus depot not far from downtown. Our crisis of faith in the future hadn't yet hit with full force, so Seattle enjoyed the best of both worlds. An old-fashioned fair with a newfangled intent. It proved a winning combination.
I'd like to welcome you to the Space Needle today. We are traveling in our west elevator, ascending at a rate of 800 feet per minute. It'll take us just 43 seconds to reach the observation deck. Total height of the structure is 605 feet, or 184 meters, and it was built in less than a year in 1962 for Century 21 Seattle World's Fair. Directly below us,
at its heart, the Space Needle, a marvel of modern engineering camouflaged as Carnival Come-On.
Exit to your right here, watch your step.
With hostesses decked out as Star Trekkies and a restaurant revolving around the top, the Space Needle capitalized on this fair's forecast of the space age and contributed to the profits that built Seattle a permanent park and cultural center.
As you may have heard, the functioning of the turntable is so smooth that you can balance a $50 on its edge or stand a cigarette on its end. You realize you're moving only when you glance up after a few moments of conversation and see that your view has changed.
Indeed, the success of Century 21 changed Seattle's entire skyline. Critics pronounced architecture, ideas, and execution original. And suddenly, Seattle was a city to reckon with. To this day, tourists write the Space Needle into their travel plans. Among the sights they can still see, another marvel of Century 21, the monorail that connects downtown to the fairgrounds. In the early 60s, planners hoped such things would ease traffic in urban areas. Seattle's monorail was supposed to be a demonstration model. Today it serves a small number of commuters and a large number of tourists who come to see the residuals, That's fair buff lingo for what a city gets to keep after the fair closes. In October 1957, when Seattle was just beginning to think of sponsoring a fair, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. The space race was on, and the U.S. was behind. The federal government spent $9 million on this science pavilion to try to inspire us to catch up.
Here you get an exciting panorama of new questions about Earth and space, matter and energy, and living things. The U.S. Science Pavilion will use nearly 10,000 fireflies, hatch 15 dozen eggs a day, use 286 frogs, 100 horseshoe crabs, 14 mice, a half-dozen electric fish, several hundred silver salmon, and 4 rhesus monkeys in public demonstrations and experiments. When we return to this building for a later telecast, they'll all be here.
The electric fish and the horseshoe crabs are gone, but the Science Pavilion remains. The liveliest part, a hands-on science center for young minds. Childish curiosity meets the funhouse trick. And the hope is that the spirit of play will launch a whole new generation of astronauts.
All day long. Oh, heavens to Betsy. Look nice and skinny here. Is that sharp?
Applause for Century 21 was still resounding as the next fair was a building. It was Robert Moses' 1964 extravaganza in New York.
How will this fair differ from other world's fairs? Well, it's bigger. There's more to see, more ground to cover, better exhibits, more of them. It's on a huge scale. Measured by acreage, numbers of exhibits, by any other norm or measure, it's on a much bigger scale.
There is the symbol of the fair, the great Unisphere.
This fair represents the most promising of our hopes. It gathers together from 80 countries the achievements of industry, the health of nations, the creations of man. This fair shows us what man at his most creative and constructive is capable of doing.
Everyone is coming to the New York World's Fair. They're coming from the 4 corners of the earth and from 5 Corners, Idaho. They come down from New Athens, Maine, and from Athens, Greece, and from Tokyo, and Kokomo, and Rome, down from Frisco and down from Troy, from Hamburg, from Nineveh, from Aurora, Illinois.
They also came from the local police precinct. No longer was it possible for a World's Fair to wall out the wider world.
We're going to the Unisphere, where we've set up headquarters, and from there we will go to certain pavilions.
What pavilions? What are you playing?
James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality.
There we will be picketing in protest against the continuation of segregation in Louisiana, and to show the glaring contrast between the glitter fantasy world being shown at the World's Fair and the real world of brutality and poverty and hatred and vengeance which Negroes face in Louisiana.
Certainly there were gathering storms over civil rights and the war in Southeast Asia. Nonetheless, this fair attracted every imaginable commercial exhibit. Once again, GM built an elaborate Futurama. This one, however, steered clear of foretelling any exact date. Instead, undersea, outer space, and tundra villages were envisioned for some vague, far-off future time. Among the most lavish and successful exhibits, the IBM Pavilion. Computers were just beginning to dawn on the public consciousness and were regarded by some as remote and threatening. IBM set out to accustom the uninitiated to yet another new idea.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the IBM Information Machine.
The railroad scene is familiar, even nostalgic, but it is large and very complex.
The machine brings you information in much the same way as your mind gets it, in fragments and glimpses, sometimes relating to the same idea or incident.
Apples become barrels, barrels become boxcars, boxcars become waybills, waybills become train lists, and so on and so on. Each abstraction a little farther from the reality we know, a little easier to handle. To the simplest of the abstractions, the ones and zeros. These can be handled at great speed, and soon the selected information finds its way back into a familiar reality.
We solve our ordinary problems in much the same way as we solve our most complicated ones. The programming of computers to handle data and build revealing relationships is just a fine elaboration of the familiar methods we all know and use every day.
On the cultural side, too, the New York World's Fair was a major production, offering a dizzying array of cultural come-ons. The notion that less is more held no appeal for Robert Moses. To him, more was more, and his fair showed it. Still, there were a few diamonds among the rough, including Michelangelo's Pieta, brought all the way from Rome. Critics complained about expense, about crowding and commercialism. But certainly by 1964, extravagance may have seemed the only way a fair could compete with other entertainments for your money and attention.
Some places make you happy just to be in them.
World's fairs, as a rule, are ephemeral. Will there be anything lasting at this one?
Oh, yes, indeed. In the first place, we'll have several new buildings, but over and above that, we're going to finish Flushing Meadow Park with the receipts of the fair. And when I say that, I think it'll be the finest park in the city of New York. It's right at the geographical and population center, and I think it will cost about $10 million to finish the park. The landscaping will be here, the trees will still be here. About half the utilities have been put in on a permanent basis, so they'll stay. And this will be a great park, the park.
For all Moses' certainty, it was just not to be. This is the park today. The New York World's Fair finished its two-season run, $21 million in the red. The fair had been built on the same ground as the '39 fair, built, too, on the same ambition of leaving a noble legacy. What remains hardly gladdens the heart.
Critics seem to praise fairs for their showmanship, for their entertainment value, for their hoopla, and dismiss these higher purposes which many of the planners envisioned for them. Why? Is that true? Do you think that's what critics mostly do?
Well, I think it's true that the serious purpose does get lost underneath the hoopla. You know, there are themes like peace through understanding. It seems laughable when you would expect that the 1964 fair would expect us to understand the world through its material products as produced by the industrial companies. This is really not the key to understanding, and yet it is. If we look at these products, these are things that we deal with every day. By looking at them more closely, we can perhaps understand ourselves better. The very fact that that fair was heavily commercialized said something very important about our culture at that particular moment. In spite of themselves, fairs do provide wonderful cultural indicators.
The question of whether fairs have outlived their usefulness is raised with nearly every fair. It didn't deter Knoxville. And in this country alone, plans are already underway for fairs in New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. The Chicago Fair in 1992 will celebrate Columbus's discovery of this continent. Perhaps it is a sign of emerging maturity that this nation now seems willing to have a past as well as a future. So, looking back and looking ahead, the grand and foot-wearing tradition of convening a crowd will continue. But you suspect that if the past is a guide, we will go to the fairs of the future, expecting the best is yet to come. When archaeologists dig up our civilization somewhere ages and ages hence, I hope they'll come across the preserved remains of our world's fairs, such as this replica of a Ferris wheel from the early part of this century. Fairs have marked a number of milestones in our progress, and even in the darkest times, even in the hands of the hucksters, they've comforted us with the notion that brains and brawn, faith and courage will somehow lead us on. As long ago as the time of the Greeks and Romans, people sought out opportunities to gather together at great festivals. The sports arenas and market squares archaeologists are always uncovering were, many of them, fairgrounds of a kind where the ancients came to celebrate themselves. True, it now seems harder for a fair to scale the heights of our imagination the way, say, St. Louis did. But Ferris wheels and other joys are still with us, because someone had the passion to believe there was something worth showing off about, and others understood the need to bear constant witness to human ingenuity and the need for human recreation. Those still seem good ideas, especially when times are tough, because celebration has within it the seeds of inspiration and a little fun. We need all we can get of both. I'm Bill Moyers.
A variety of animals have adapted remarkably well to the encroachment of humans. See how some have not only survived man's progress, but are even thriving inside the city limits on Wild America, Saturday night at 8 on KCTS 9 Seattle.
This program has been brought to you by the people of Chevron, who have been helping to supply America's energy needs throughout the 20th century.